And you touched a couple of times on the intersectionality of all of these issues. I want to focus on that a little bit because there's many different intersections that could be addressed. So I want to give it a little bit of time for each of you to speak to the many intersections that are at play.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can start with a really specific and really current example, which is the recent investigation, if you want to call it that, by Eastern Mennonite University of the abuse that was perpetrated by their former vice president of enrollment, Luke Hartman. And, you know, this is a hard one to talk about for a whole bunch of reasons. But Jay and I have been fairly involved with survivor support and advocacy related to this particular case from the beginning of, you know, the sort of public exposure of it, particularly with Lauren Shiflett's story coming out on Our Stories Untold, where she talked about being, you know, groomed and then eventually stalked and terrorized by him. And what we found was that there was a rush away from accountability at EMU. You know, Luke Hartman is a Mennonite who was raised in a white Mennonite family, and he's African American, and he has been an incredibly inspiring and motivating figure for a lot of students of color in Mennonite colleges, not just at EMU. I mean, he's been a speaker nationally for a long time. And so, like, it's really, like, it is really hard to pull out all the sites of betrayal that have happened around this particular case at Eastern Mennonite. But, you know, there's such there's a hiring of a firm that specializes in getting institutions into Title IX and Clery Act compliance. And it's a consulting firm, and they will only investigate what you ask them to investigate. Well, they came out with a report that said, well, really, like, you know, Luke Hartman is guilty, but nobody did anything wrong beyond that. Everyone responded appropriately at every stage. Well, you know, we've talked to a lot of survivors from EMU, and we know that that is simply not true. You know, there was a point when EMU administrators knew that Luke Hartman had had an affair with a woman who was 19 or 20 years old. An affair, I'm putting that in quotation marks. 19 or 20 years old. They knew that and did not ask further questions. You're still accountable for the questions for the answers to the questions that you didn't ask. Now, what does that have to do with intersectionality? Well, okay, you've got an institution that is primarily led by white administrators. You have one administrator who happens to be African American and happens to be a sexual perpetrator. And you've created an institutional narrative that absolves all observers, all people around him, from any responsibility whatsoever. And may I add, like, not a true narrative. Like, when something like this happens on your watch, you take responsibility for it. You say, I messed up on this one. I should have seen the signs. I should have asked the questions. I didn't do it. You know, there is an institutional problem. Instead, like, you know, this is not an interpretation that you would hear, like, people who are part of this process put forward, obviously. But really, we can pin it on the black man and not take ownership for our own institutional failings. Because everything that happened in the abuse that happened within that situation is utterly mundane, horrifying, but mundane. It is a standard sexual abuse of power. You know, the outlines of this, you know, the story of the way that Luke Hartman interacted with Lauren Shiflett, if you read her narrative, are like broadly recognizable to anybody who understands sexually abusive, grooming, stalking, interactions. And it is not at all uncommon for that kind of behavior to be perpetrated by people who have a great deal of social power. However, there's a convenient out on this one, which is that the person who had a great deal of social power, who perpetrated this stuff, happens to be a person of color. And therefore, they fall into a really powerful social scapegoating narrative that's fundamentally racist. And I am baffled that there isn't more institutional recognition of that. I guess I'm not baffled. I guess I'm not surprised, but I'm just terribly frustrated by it.
And there are questions about, so there's this moment, right, when EMU is notified that Luke Hartman has had a quote unquote affair with a 19 or 20-year-old from his home congregation to whom he taught Sunday school. And in that moment, EMU didn't ask more questions. And it's really hard to tease apart, but what part of that is, well, we're all members of this Mennonite community, what part of that is shame and sexuality and well, again, your body got out of control, you did something bad, pray, and it will be okay, as opposed to seeing it as any sort of possible violence. And what part of that is, well, you're one of the few prominent Black Mennonites that we have on our staff. If I ask further questions, if we lose you, we lose diversity, right? What part of that is tokenization? And these are the really hard questions that we don't get to ask ourselves, or the conversations we don't get to have if our priority as a church is clearing people from legal wrongdoing and not getting sued. And if our priority is not figuring out how to take appropriate responsibility and accountability where we need to take it, and figuring out how to undo racism that might have gotten in the way of us asking the right questions, how to figure out, a lack of expertise and understanding of sexualized violence that got in the way of us asking the right questions. Gendered questions, like what all got in the way of EMU asking the right questions and thinking through what it would mean to continue having on their staff a man who had a really inappropriate power differential relationship with a very young woman who was the same age as students that this leader would be working with on campus. What got in the way of EMU asking the right questions and, preventing violence in the future? Because I can tell you right now, and I don't really have any qualms about it, that if Stephanie or I were sitting in that room, we would have asked at least some of the right questions. And we would have said, this is a problem. We have a big problem here. If you target very young women for sexual relationships.
Yeah.
And so that's where expertise comes in and experience comes in. Sexualized violence, especially in Christian contexts, is often not recognized because it's treated as sexual sin. And violence and power don't play in.
Yeah. Sin is a real catch-all word. The other thing I would say is one of the major things that is lost when this kind of thing happens is that you create this sort of illusion that the work of racial justice and the work of justice for sexual violence survivors are two separate struggles that are at odds with each other. And we see this again and again in institutional contexts, certainly in Mennonite ones. Any marginalized group is inevitably treated as a group of people with needs that are going to take resources.
A competitor for resources.
A competitor for resources. And so it's profitable to pit them against each other. It happens again and again. The Mennonite Church USA has a roaring case of it. And what I look at something like EMU's situation with Luke Hartman, and I think, okay, we know that particularly women of color, people of color in general, and women of color and LGBT people of color are some of the most vulnerable people to sexual violence in our societies. There are a lot of reasons why that isn't recognized by white sexual violence advocates in the way that it should be. But my question is, when you have a situation like this where the survivors advocates have really been sort of painted as antagonists, then what happens to the survivors of color in that context? Who, if there is no way of providing service and providing a way of approaching sexual violence that understands that it doesn't happen outside of the context of race. If you don't have that anywhere in your institutional context, then you have survivors of color who are not safe speaking anywhere. And I am really worried about that in Mennonite institutions, because I see the triangulation happening so clearly.
No, I want to tell a story that sort of illustrates a few of Stephanie's points, not all of them, but a few of them. So in Mennonite Church USA, when they had their big gathering, their convention in Kansas City, a few things happened. There was a lot of talk about sexualized violence. There was a lot of talk about queer folks. And there was some talk about, well, it was the summer of Black Lives Matter. So that was also, violence against Black folks was also prominent. And these were treated as 3 separate issues by Mennonite Church USA. When we know that, as Stephanie said, queer folks and people of color are more vulnerable to sexualized violence. So definitely intersectional. And all of my friends, all of my queer Mennonite friends who are people of color, except one, are closeted. Because there's not a lot of real space in the Mennonite church for queer people of color, just like there's not a lot of space for survivors of color. So two particular moments in Kansas City that really struck me were, so of course, Mennonite Church USA voted to uphold its, I'm flaking, Stephanie,
Membership guidelines
that, I'm just loosely, queer folks can't really be members. Just gonna say that. So they chose to uphold these membership guidelines that like queer folks can't be real full members. They simultaneously passed a resolution that, if you kind of dig through the fine print of, says, we understand that sexualized violence, that queer folks are more susceptible to sexualized violence, especially when they're marginalized and treated as second-class citizens. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but that was in there. So they sort of simultaneously said, you are second-class citizens, and we recognize that treating you that way makes you more susceptible to sexualized violence. And that, I mean, it just hit me so profoundly when I read that, like, we know this makes you more susceptible to sexualized violence, and we're cool with that, is what I heard loud and clear in Kansas City as a queer person. And then one other really intersectional moment for me was when, you know, MCUSA was voting about queer folks and their belonging in the church, without inviting any queer folks to sort of speak formally in the process from the stage. And so queer folks had a protest where we took the stage and did some theater. And during it, we had our first Latina woman moderator of the church. So during that, she stood up and started trying to take the microphone. If you want to see a more direct, embodied version of marginalized communities competing for resources, I'm not sure there's a better example than literally, this woman saying like, no, you can't speak right now, and us saying like, we don't have any other place where we're allowed to speak. And then she began praying in her first language of Spanish. And so there was this just horrible moment of, me as a white, queer, genderqueer person, like with a microphone, asking to be heard. But if I want to be heard, I have to shout over a Latina woman praying in her native language of Spanish. I mean, that is probably the most embodied, like, intersectional, people being pitted against each other that I have experienced, and it happens all the time in less visible ways. But that moment for me was really like, there are so many things not right about this. And I'm not angry at her. I'm angry at our denomination that, demands that of her if she's going to hold that position, and that forces queer folks into the position of, having to compete for that space. So there were a lot of really intersectional moments at MCUSA, while he was simultaneously trying to say, over here we'll talk about Black violence, over here we'll talk about sexualized violence, and over here we'll talk about queer issues. Which is, I think, what Stephanie just said, but in story form.
Yeah, well, and I mean, the place where people really tried to push past that was the Pink Menno room.
Yeah.
Just in the kind of programming that they chose to do. But yeah, it's tough because, especially when you have a religious culture that's sort of as conflict averse as Mennonites tend to be, it's so hard to talk about the things that you have to talk about to stop this kind of violence from happening, because it's just, I was in some of those delegate rooms, or the delegate hall for some of those instances at Mennonite Church USA or at the Kansas City meeting, and I just had this sense that I've had so many times in the course of being involved with queer justice and sexualized violence work in the Mennonite Church, and just feminist and dismantling white supremacy work in general, that you can be in a room and you can see what feels and looks and feels in your body like tremendous violence, and then there are other people in the room who totally don't see it, and they're like, what are you so upset about? And part of why that dynamic happens is that Mennonites do not know how to address conflict in a healthy way. I mean, people say that right and left, and it's nothing revolutionary to identify that, but you've got these areas of so much shame. Talking about racism always makes white people so defensive. Talking about LGBT issues makes a lot of people lose their minds. Talking about disability, people don't aside from disabled people who have made it their business, it's so marginalized in the church structure. And then talking about sexual violence, oh my God, you have to talk about sex. I mean, it's we are so we need a lot of work. We need a lot of help.
We're really good at going into other contexts and helping people resolve their conflicts.
Yeah.
We are not really good. Just like I say, you're never you're never that right expert for your own context. Like, we are not the right expert on conflict transformation for our own context, or we would have had it figured out by now, because we are stacked with, renowned experts on having difficult conversations. But we have siloed conversations, controlled conversations. It's very difficult for us. And
so what are those opportunities to lean into? What are the assets of the church, Anabaptism, of Anabaptist theology that we could really be leveraging that aren't currently, or maybe are, but could be better emphasized?
Well, okay. So first of all, I know a number of really awesome people who are currently completing graduate degrees in theology and just in fields that could really help us. So like, I'm thinking of 3 really specific people off the top of my head. I know a few that have already completed that work. So like I think we have, if we are willing to listen, we have some excellent younger folks who have like really thought about the best parts of Anabaptist theology and the worst parts of Anabaptist history, and are thinking about how we can both hold ourselves accountable for our participations in violence and move forward in productive and really healthy spiritual ways. So I think there's that. And then I think, I'm also the communications and engagement director at Christian Peacemaker Teams, and I love some of the work that CPT does of thinking about surfacing conflict as a part of peacemaking. I think that a lot of people, I'm going to plug CPT a little bit and say CPT does those trainings. I think a lot of people could use, some smaller versions of nonviolence trainings that aren't just about like, I think we think of it, nonviolence trainings, as like how to like calm people down. They're really how to surface that conflict and approach it well. And then SNAP and Into Account and Our Stories Untold, man, if people want help figuring out how to prevent and address sexualized violence, how to open up churches and institutions to make them spaces where it's safe to talk about it, we are here and we know what we're talking about. And it is smart to listen to us. I think that we are stacked with people who can be helpful if we are given the power and the space to do so. I think one of the biggest mistakes that MCUSA has made in the last year was to appoint and then reject the counsel of a really excellent expert committee to panel on preventing sexual abuse. We appointed this expert panel to help us figure out how to do this. And then as soon as it made a recommendation, it was shunted aside and moved ahead without, the process moved on without them. We have to stop making the same old mistakes and actually listen to the experts, which is going to require some people admitting that they're not experts and they're not qualified. And that's hard to do.
It's hard to do, and it's especially hard to do in a church where, like, white men basically run things, because white men have a lot of trouble hearing that. Because, it just the fact that I'm saying that probably makes a lot of white men defensive, but it's just, you don't have expertise by virtue of having been given an authoritative role by the culture that you happen to be born into.
Stephanie, I can hear a lot of white Mennonite leaders listing all of their female and people of color colleagues in their heads right now.
Right, right. Of course they are. Of course they are. That's the first thing they do. Anyway, you know, all quipping aside, and that's not really quipping. I mean, I sounded a little edgy, but I really mean everything I just said.
Yeah.
I mean, our biggest hurdle in sexual violence work is silence and disengagement. And our biggest asset is like our incredible community of survivors. And when you look at a community of survivors, you will always find an intersectionally rigorous, diverse group of people because of the way that sexualized violence hits people who are already socially marginalized. Some of your best resources for transformation are going to be found in communities of sexualized violence survivors. They can talk about trauma. They can talk about resilience and survival. They can talk about what violence looks like when other people can't perceive it. Like there's such a wealth there, and it is in Anabaptist and Mennonite and like affiliated evangelical groups. That wisdom is there. Like the hurdle, again, I'm not sure that it's even the power structures. I think it's the silence and easily intimidated complicity of people in the pews. That is our primary hurdle. Like the white men who can't let go of power, they could be gone tomorrow. they're the, and I don't mean like I wish them ill, but the kind of power that leads them to do active harm could be removed from them tomorrow. If people would start taking more responsibility for what happens in their communities, in their churches. You know, we have the resources that we need, and we have the resources to help us understand when we need to, you know, look elsewhere. As Jay said, when we're like, oh, we are not the right experts for our own context, we've got a situation. We have that knowledge in Anabaptist communities. We just need to be, I think we need to be more comfortable naming abuses of power and, you know, the kind of dynamics that lead us to ignore the expertise in our own midst.
Absolutely. And I'm going to go totally off the rails here just for a minute and say, you know, that power structure that Stephanie is naming in MCUSA, as she so eloquently put it, it's pretty much run by white dudes. It's also, we also have a sort of theory of ourselves as being non-hierarchical, right? We don't necessarily have really clear policies and practices and structures, and if this happens, then this person is informed, and then they take it here, and then they deal with it in this way. And one thing that, I guess two things coming out of that. One thing that I think we need to be careful of as the Anabaptist family sort of grows, as more and more people are attracted to a peace theology and to something different from the maybe restrictive or purity focused or you know, shaming cultures of other churches they may be coming from. They may be attracted to Anabaptist theology, and they may be attracted to the idea of non-hierarchy. And one thing I think we need to be really careful of is that in some of those situations, sexual violence can flourish because there is no, because they operate on a charismatic leader model, which is really susceptible to sexualized violence. So if there's one pastor that rises up and creates a church and they're not really attached to a denomination or any sort of broader hierarchy, and they do some damage or they engage in sexualized violence, then there's no sort of space for accountability, right? And especially if it rises up in a way that's distrustful of outsiders. And so I just want us to be aware as Anabaptism grows, and to sort of work together not to grow in that way, preferably.
Mm-hmm.
And because that's like, that can be some of our problem already. Some of the intersectional work that we've done is we work closely with advocates who do sexual violence advocacy work in Orthodox Jewish contexts and in Muslim contexts, because they find a sort of similar non-hierarchy and we find similar ways of sexual violence operating in each of our contexts that are a little different from, say, the Catholic Church, which has this really clear hierarchy and system and process. So that's my sort of last off the rails, one last thing that we should all be thinking about when we think about sexualized violence in Anabaptist context.
Sort of piggybacking on that, like there's, I think we also really have to resist the idea of sexual violence as something that's like a conservative problem or a liberal problem, and like as though that those are clean categories anyway. But we tend to, we can blame it on sexual permissiveness. Conservatives will often blame it on sexual permissiveness, and that gets rolled into a purity ethic. Liberals will often blame it on sexual repression. And the fact is, like, we see both of those things as really powerful factors. And I think that dichotomy, it actually allows sexual violence to flourish. And it leads people who come from really sexually repressive environments to move, to maybe find like a more progressive church that people don't want to talk about sexual boundaries because they've been punished by sexual boundaries their whole life. But if you can't talk about sexual boundaries at all, somebody's going to get abused. Yeah, that's a challenge that, like, those extremes are all fully embodied and in operation in the world of Anabaptism. And so we really have to be cognizant of them and how they feed each other.
Yes, I would just second that. It's a problem if we're talking about all sexuality outside of a really narrow context as shameful and horrible. And it's a problem if if we think that naming sexual violence or sexual boundaries is harmful because it's repressive. So we have to be able to find balances where we can say, look, here's how consent operates, right? Here's what violence can look like. Here's an example of a really healthy sexual relationship. And now it is between you and your congregation and your relationship with God to decide what you are going to do sexually with your body, which should never be anything that you don't want to do. That's how I would say it. Mm-hmm. But we're pretty bad at having those conversations because we do tend to, like she said, we travel back and forth. Well, the sexual permissiveness over here is what allowed sexual violence to happen, so I need to go somewhere more restrictive, which is what we see in the report of the investigation at EMU, to bring it back to this investigation that, I'm sorry if people are watching who don't know what it is, but a firm investigated a college where there was sexual violence, and one of the things that they said was really double down on those community standards, which the community standards are about no sexuality outside of marriage. So, people say, oh, the permissiveness is what led to the sexual violence. Hammer down on your restricting all sexuality. Or people go, oh, that sexual shaming is really what led to the sexual violence. So let's be more open and not as repressive. And then we never talk about boundaries. And, then shame operates in a different way. Okay. Yeah. I'm done. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Yeah, I mean, really, like, we need to talk more about power. Mm-hmm. I feel like a broken record on that. But yeah, we do. And how power is sexualized.
Yeah. And that would be the counterbalance to that whole narrative of our bodies just get out of control and do lustful things that they shouldn't be doing. The balance would be, let's talk about the way that power operates in sexualized violence.
Mm-hmm.
And that, forcing yourself sexually on someone else is about power and domination and not about a lustful, out of control body.
Right. You made a really important point that I just want to lift up and highlight a little bit more, that talking through and focusing on these things are very important, particularly as we see more and more people interested in Anabaptism and in general coming into our churches, because we risk simply perpetuating and recapitulating our own cultural pathologies on others, and just that importance of focus right now, to do the good work that you both are doing, and that's so important. I appreciate you both very much, and your time with us. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversations and everything that you've had to contribute. To invite folks that, as you've been listening and have been intrigued, definitely check out Into Account, check out Snap, check out Pink Menno. As we've been saying tonight, there's lots of really good resources out there. And so let me just turn it over to each of you in turn to offer any final word that you might have, and then point folks to any other particular resources that you might want them to have.
Sure. So you can check out our website, intoaccount.org, and you can contact us through there if you need anything or you just want to learn more. Stephanie, you want to talk about Snap and our Stories Untold?
Yeah. Oh, and also with Into Account, we've just recently gotten fiscal sponsorship that we haven't quite finalized the paperwork for yet, but people should be able to donate to us soon, hopefully within the next week or so, on our website. So you'll see things pick up on our website fairly soon. I think we have been a little bit dormant for a bit because we've been working on securing that fiscal sponsorship that is now in place. In terms of Snap, you can find Snap at snapnetwork.org. I will be the first to say that Snap Network is not necessarily a website-based organization. It's not the greatest website, but one good way to find, if you just Google Mennonite Abuse Prevention List, you can see the resources that we have on the Snap website related to the naming of specific church leaders who are credibly accused sexual offenders. The other excellent resource is ourstoriesuntold.com. Particularly for survivors, if you want to think about coming forward with your story in whatever degree of anonymity or lack thereof you're comfortable with, if you just want resources for having more informed conversations about sexualized violence, that is an excellent place to start. So, and we are available for questions for, if there's a specific incident that you want to report or talk about, a specific individual that, you need help dealing with, or whatever it is, please feel free to contact us, and you can get our contact information at intoaccount.org.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. Great conversation, and I think probably worth additional conversation going forward. We can see if we can get some follow-ups as things progress with exciting things ahead, which is really wonderful. I want to thank everyone who is watching live and will watch as we publish these conversations. My name is Katelin Hansen, and a pleasure once again to be with you all.
Hey everyone, this is Paul Walker. If you like what you just heard, be sure to check out more of what we have to offer at MennoNerds.com. It's the hub for all things MennoNerds. From there, you can learn more about these podcasts, syndicated blogs from people all over the world, books authored by some of our members, and a host of other exciting free resources for you and your church. Now, there's one last thing. What we do costs a bit of money, and we're always doing it on a volunteer basis. We have people that are committed to making this happen, but we could use more people. If you like what we do, please consider donating monthly. We have two options. You can either do a monthly donation through Patreon, or you can give a one-time donation at any time through PayPal. We love the work we do, but we do need your help to keep it going and to expand into new territory. If you would like to donate, check out MennoNerds.com/donate. Thanks for listening, and as always, have a great day.